Hello everyone, Books with Banks back again with another video. Today I'm back with another book review video. And today I'm reviewing my first foray into the widely popular fantasy worlds of Sarah J. Maas. I'll be reviewing book one of Maas's ongoing series. This book right here, and both this first book and the series are referred to by fans as A Court of Thorns and Roses, ACOTAR for short. Before I get into the review, however, if you haven't already, it would mean a lot if you could please like and subscribe. Thank you so much. Also, I should say I won't really be going into spoilers here. I won't be saying anything that happens past the first 30, 40 pages or so of the book, and even at that, I'll be pretty vague. But yeah, here we go. First things first. I kind of want to address the popular conceptions, maybe misconceptions about these books, and the typical sort of intended audience, and how I fall somewhat outside of what someone might expect that audience to be. So Maas is known for writing young adult romantic fantasy fiction. I believe her first series, or at least the series she started writing first that garnered a lot of critical acclaim and attention, was the Throne of Glass series, which is now comprised of 7 novels and 1 collection of novellas. I do intend to check out that Throne of Glass series at some point as well, but from what I understand, the Throne of Glass stuff was much more targeting young adult audiences. The series structure and mixed reviews I've heard about it definitely have me intrigued. But what does all that have to do with The Court of Thorns and Roses? Well, apparently partway through the writing and publication of that other YA series, Maas started working on these books, intending them more for adult audiences, or perhaps audiences that maybe got into her Throne of Glass series when they were younger, maybe when they were teens, and then grew up a little bit, and now they might be looking for something a little bit more mature, something that dealt with more complex characters, weightier themes, and yes, of course, some sexier romantic scenes. Now, any fans of my channel will know that I'm not particularly opposed to reading descriptive romantic scenes in my fantasy, as I particularly enjoy the way authors like Diana Gabaldon tackle such content in like Gabaldon's Outlander series. I will say that while at least there is a limited amount of adult content that we have here in the first ACOTAR book, it's much less than what we get in, say, Gabaldon's Outlander books. And it's not nearly as intense, nor is it as descriptive as some of those scenes. It's also not as emotionally engaging. I don't care as much about the sex or the sexual tension in this book as I do in some other books, the sex scenes in other books. At least not yet. That's just with this first book, book 1 of the series. Yeah. Now, this could change, and as I said, there really is hardly anything adult like that in the book anyway. From what I've been told, the romantic scenes increase in frequency and intensity throughout the series as you go further in. But anyway, that all sort of leads into the point I want to make about how I'm probably not the typical intended audience for these books, but I do think Maas does plenty here that could appeal to fantasy fans, even if you're someone who typically likes to stay away from the genres and subgenres I've just described. Now for slightly more thorough description of what the book is actually about. So you have this young woman, Feyre, and she lives in poverty in a small cottage in the woods with her 2 sisters and her father. Her whole family unit is pretty much described as useless, and Feyre has to do everything, including hunting. Whilst out on a hunt, she kills something, or maybe someone, that she's not supposed to, and she gets into all sorts of trouble because of that. And a brief world description, I guess, here. This world has a clear dividing line, even on the map, between the world of the humans, below the wall, where Feyre and her family live, and then there's the magic world north of the wall, called Prythian, where the fairies live. And Prythian is divided into 7 courts, each of which is ruled by their own high lords. And because of Feyre's actions on her hunting trip, she is basically abducted to go live in one of these courts, the southernmost court, the Spring Court. wherein she meets Tamlin, a man who can transform into a beast, but she also meets other magical persons living in and among the Spring Court. As this Beauty and the Beast scenario unfolds, more and more mysteries are introduced, romantic tension builds and builds, and the realities and lore of this magical world of Prythian are revealed at a steady and intriguing pace to keep readers hooked and guessing all throughout the first 2/3 of the book. Now, there is a turning point, but again, I won't say anything more on that because I really don't want to spoil anything. So, let's talk about the writing itself. I would say probably my biggest complaints or criticisms of this book are on a technical writing level. Some of you might think they're a little bit more nitpicky sort of complaints. And to be fair, they sort of are, because they haven't really ruined my experience. They haven't made me have too much worse of a time with the book. I still really enjoyed it despite these things. But I did find in this book, Maas just repeats a few phrases and types of descriptors that I find distracting every now and then. Instead of using a variety of adjectives, she sometimes relies too much on describing things as being too whatever adjective. So an example, his too long fingers, or her too short temper, or the too bright rays of the sun, so like too dash adjective. She does this a lot, and I'm not the biggest fan of that. The other thing is, because she's describing these fairies and magical stuff, and the fairies are basically a species that's different than the human race, a lot of times to, I guess, maybe emphasize that, because they're not strictly human and need to be differentiated from humans, instead of saying the man did this or the woman did that, she'll say the male did this or the female did that. Now, of course, this is just my personal preference, but I really can't stand when masculine characters are described as the male and feminine characters are the female. Reading it that way, the way it sounds in my head just doesn't really flow that well to me. And it kind of makes me think of science class, the male of the species will do it. And I just don't really like that. I don't like thinking about characters who, for all intents and purposes, have the range of human emotion. And I'm just not the biggest fan of that. Anyway, on a good note, if those technical nitpicks are my biggest complaints, the rest of the book must be pretty good, right? Well, yes, generally speaking, I thoroughly enjoyed this whole book. I would actually say I enjoyed it much more than I expected. From friends of mine and other fans of the series online, I had heard that this one in particular was one of the weaker entries and weaker books by Sarah J. Maas. So while I was determined to kind of get through this one to try and enjoy the later books, I actually had a really nice time here. I was pleasantly surprised. I found it refreshing to read a fantasy novel with a much smaller, restrained cast, or at least the majority of the book is restricted really to only 5 or 6 named characters, and it moves along at a relatively brusque pace. Now, it didn't pose any particularly challenging questions or bring up any of my favorite themes or ideas, but based on where this book left off, it does seem that Maas has left herself many open doors to explore more complex themes, more complex character arcs. She's also, in the last third or kind of fourth of this book, introduced enough wrinkles, enough new intriguing characters, so I'm really excited to see where she takes all of these things that kind of come up in the last 100 or so pages of this book. A few other things that I think work very well here. Maas smartly provides plenty of symbols and similarities to other popular fantasy and romance stories and tropes early on to hook us, but all the while, she keeps hinting at how unstable our interpretation of Farah's situation actually is, because we're seeing everything through Farah's ignorant lens. Maas is keenly aware of this and uses it to great effect. Some examples of what I mean here. I'll use some examples because this mystery is sort of entangling what's actually going on in Prythian. This is easily my favorite thing about the book. So examples for readers coming to this as epic adult fantasy fans, there's a wall and there's 7 kingdoms, so we're immediately comforted in memories on these kind of symbols that remind us of Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire and the Game of Thrones adaptation. But other than these 2 recognizable, comfortable symbols, nothing about this fantasy world is anything like I've ever read, nor is it like anything that Farah expected. So we're sort of along with her for that ride. Initially, our assumptions are, oh, typical fantasy things that we recognize, similar to Feyre, as her expectations are overthrown or discarded, so are ours. We also have the Beauty and the Beast, kind of Stockholm Syndrome, really kind of dated, creepy trope, and that sort of love story. But it never feels like Maas is trying to make any excuses for the captors or for the captive falling for the captor. It's never really presented that this is like entirely a good thing, a good captive situation, because of course that sounds a little bit oxymoronical. Anyway, we know they're not telling their prisoner everything, the captors aren't, and we, the readers, are left with this really uncomfortable, icky sort of suspicion, a feeling that, at least for me, still lingers even after most of the mysteries are revealed. I think the best example of how well Maas ties this mystery sort of element in with her world building is really simple, really easy thing that she does, or maybe it's not easy, but it's a really straightforward technique she uses. Feyre has this whole misconception that the high fae nobility and the fairies of Prythian can't tell lies, which is an assumption that is repeated a couple times early on in the book, and an assumption that I think most of us readers probably start off pretty skeptical of, and Maas just, I think, uses this really, really well. Yeah. One final thing. While I enjoyed the structural shift in the final section of the book, it is a bit jarring thinking that all of that happens in the same book as all of the kind of Beauty and the Beast stuff from earlier on, and I haven't quite decided whether or not I enjoy the stark or like how strong that contrast is between those two parts of the story. But I will say I thoroughly enjoyed each part of the story. It's just like where they kind of come together, both being in the same novel, that I'm maybe just a little bit iffy on. But anyway, those are my thoughts. Great book. If you're hesitant to read this because it's a romance, and or if you've heard it might be a little more YA, I'd say still at least give it a try, especially if you're a fantasy fan, and especially if you like to see some tropes deconstructed. I'm in it for the long haul now, and I can't wait to see what else Maas has in store for me in this magical land of Prythian. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great day. Bye.